Okay, we're continuing. Really, last time we spoke, halacha also. Last time we mentioned one of the rayas one of the gemaras that had to do with Yotzim Natame. It was a gemara about tzir. So what we're going to do today is going to touch on that. We're going to come to that towards the end. And we're going to talk about a shaila. It belongs in the sin in some place, which is whether the Techeles that we use for tzitzis and the Beis Hamikdash, is it possible that Techeles could come from a treif animal, from a treif fish, which was a very theoretical question. So here, Poskim talked about it even earlier, but it was really a theoretical question, except that in the past 100 years or so, two different people have come up with ideas, two bigger people have come up with ideas of what they think Techeles is. Either they think that it's a cuttlefish or a Murex trunculus. Okay, there are other ones also. I'm sorry, there are other ones also. And all of them, they all have in common is they're all treif fish. Okay, they're all treif sea creatures, call them what you want to. So that made it that much more prominent. The shaila of is it possible that you can make Techeles out of a treif fish? Okay, what's the question? Is it a Kashrus question? Well, this is the simon of Yotzim Natame, and it actually what we're going to talk about directly connects to it. It's not we haven't been asked to give Hashgacha to it yet.
Well, we're not eating it.
So that's what the shaila is. That's what we're going to talk about. Whether that means anything. If we were asked, then we'd have to do it. Right so far, we haven't been asked to give Hashgacha to it. Okay, the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says in Shabbos. The Gemara says that when you use something for a mitzvah, it's got to come from. It has to come from something that's kosher. Okay, the Gemara says it in two different ways. The Gemara first says, that's one rule. That when you're making something from lecha shemaim, it's talking about the Beis Hamikdash. It has to come from something that's tahar. And the other is that the pasuk says, "Laman tia teres Hashem beficha." That teres Hashem has to be beficha. It has to be something that you can put into your mouth. So therefore, from that we learn also that the things that are used for mitzvahs have to be kosher. Okay, for Torah. So I know you're trying. I'm getting to you in a second. Yes, you're right. We're getting to it in a second. Okay, so the simple understanding is, so that means what does that negate to us every day? Is that when your tefillin have to be made from an animal, the cloth is made from a kosher animal, and the mezuzah that's on this door, that cloth that was written came from an animal that's kosher. Okay? The simple understanding is that when we say that rule, it doesn't mean that it has to be from actually a kosher piece of or that's not what it has to come from, but it has to come from a min that's kosher. Okay, that is to say, is you have to take a cow's hide and not a horse's hide. But the fact that the cow was never shechted, or that the cow was a treifa, is not negay. It doesn't mean anything. They go just to any place and get cow hides, and that's good enough. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be kosher as in kosher that I can eat it. Why do we know that? Why do we assume like that that's true like that? Because the truth is that hides of animals are kosher altogether. Hides of of horses are kosher anyhow, because the dinim of basar is asur and hides are not asur. And the Gemara says that for gidin, the tying of gidin are also can be kosher here, and all these things are kosher. So it tells us that what we're looking for is the hide of a kosher min. That is to say, we understand the Rebbe Hashem didn't want us to use hides from treif minin. There's something about treif minin. We didn't want them to use them for doing mitzvahs, but not that they're actually kosher, that someone shechted them and checked them for treifas b'chayin.
Not pigs.
What did you say?
He said it's supposed to be.
The pigs is special. The Gemara in Chulin says the pig hide may be treif. That's a special thing. What? Right. It's special. Pigs are special. Pigs' hides are different than other hides. But horses' hides and things like that, that's what it is. Okay. So this issue came up, you may remember, it was a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, maybe even more, came up a question of whether certain cows were kosher or treif. Okay? The most famous ones were called the zebu cows, or the brangus cows, which is a mix of cows. And those cows, there's a whole to-do whether they're kosher or not. It had to do with, because they have no Masorah. Of course, they have the simanim of being kosher. They have all the regular simanim of malagir and mafres parsa, but they have no Masorah of being kosher. The whole to-do came up about it. And one of the things that ended up quieting down that shiloh, okay, there were a number of things that quieted it down. What quieted it down, that is to say, from the people who wanted to be machmer, like that shita, one of the things that quieted it down was when they realized that the Sifrei Torah and the mezuzahs and all the things made of all those items were made from klaus from zebu and brangus cows. So all of a sudden, being machmer on the shiloh, all of a sudden was going to turn into.
When did that happen? You first discovered the zebu 10 years ago.
No. The zebus have been around for a long time. I don't know if since Adam Marisha, but for a long time they've been around. But what they realize is the people who make, let's say, Sefer Torah, go out and they have to buy cow hides. So the places where they were getting them from the countries they were getting it from, for them a cow was a zebra or a brain. To them, they didn't think there was an issue. When it came to eating the meat, it also went for many years until they realized it. But there's a sheikh sitting in front of the cow, and one sheikh said, "Hey, this cow doesn't look like every other cow." He realized it; they don't look the same. But when it came to the hides, they realized, all the Sefer Torah and Tefillin and mezuzahs are all written on those hides. So that put a little damper on the people wanting to be machmer, because all of a sudden it was okay. Anyhow, okay. Whether that's true, what I just said is true, is not so partial. It could be the Chazon Ish only said it for eating, that you need a Masorah. You may not need a Masorah to use it for eating. That's the share. What? Whatever. Okay, let's put it on side. Okay. Anyhow, I'm just throwing that. Okay. So now, the Gemara said, this is what David was mentioning a second ago. The Gemara said two different rules. One rule is like except for something that's kosher, and manti Techeles Hashem b'ficha. There's a nafkamina between those two reasons, and the Gemara actually handles on this. There's a nafkamina between these two reasons, which is l'manti Techeles Hashem b'ficha means things that involve Techeles Hashem, things that doesn't have to mean words of Torah, but has writing on it, like the tzitz, things that have writing on them. Those things have to be from a min kosher. Okay, but things that don't involve any writing, so to speak, don't have any divrei Torah to them, only would be chayiv, only have to be from a min kosher if you say l'huch shulum mechashmayim. Which comes out to a nafkamina. There's a machlokes in Aruch in Hilchos Rosh Hashanah. The Rama says you can't use a shofar made from a min kosher, a min tamei. You can't take a shofar from, I don't know which animal that shape has a shofar, but you can't take a shofar from a min tamei because from an animal that's kosher. And the Magen Avraham agrees. He agrees with him, but he brings it to Eil Shabbos, an early Achron. But the Eil Shabbos says that the Gemara is chayzer from that reason. When the Gemara says the reason of it starts off like that, but then the Gemara is chayzer from that and says the only way we know that you have to use a min kosher is because the mantia Techeles Hashem b'ficha. That the Gemara comes out, seems to come out l'maskon, but that's the only reason. No, if the reason is for Techeles Hashem b'ficha, shofar doesn't have Techeles Hashem. There's nothing Torah-dik about it. There's nothing. It's not a it has nothing divrei Torah in it. So there should be no din that you're mechuyev to use a kosher min for your shofar. The Shabbos holds you're allowed to use it. You want to say something? Okay. He holds.
This comes up also with chalitza shoes.
Okay.
Because she does a be'atam that you should use only from behemoth tahora, based on the pasuk ben alech tachash in Yechezkel, from which we derive that the shoe should be leather. So he says, well, just like the tachash is seen as a kosher animal because it was used in Melechas Shemayim, right, along with these lines. So too you have to use a chalitza shoe dafka from a kosher animal. And also rejects that and says that it really seems a little bit extreme.
Okay.
That it should be necessary. And halacha l'maisa, Yipaskin is a chumna v'yalma. It's not really necessary, but of course we do it.
Right.
However, you manufacture a chalitza shoe.
Yeah, but you've got one upstairs. Right. Oh yeah. Okay. Anyhow. Okay. So the Ramah says like that, and the Magen Avraham agrees with him. And Eil Shabbos argues, but the Magen Avraham says he doesn't agree with the Eil Shabbos. He says, in the end of the Gemara, really, when it learns from Techeles Hashem b'ficha, we then can learn everything out from Tefillin. Okay, that's what he learns, that in L'maskana, really all cases are included. Okay, so I just want to point out to you that the Pri Megadim, when he talks about this, he says you should just know that even though the Ramah says you're not allowed to use from a min tamei, the Ramah says it as if you're not allowed to, like that's usher. He says it's not so partial that it's usher. He says the documentary, when he brings this in, the din is coming from a Ran, who says, I think his words are toiv lahachmir. Okay, and it's a shayla whether you're allowed to use it. And the Ramah who's saying you should do it is only saying, he's saying don't use it, he needed the kodesh, just go outside from and take it from a kosher animal and make your shofar from there. But really, if a person didn't have a shofar, the Ramah doesn't mean that you shouldn't blow a shofar that year. He said at least on the first day you should take the shofar from the min tamei, not make a bracha, and you should blow it anyhow, because it's a shayla whether it's kosher or not. It's a shayla. The Ramah says it like, as in don't use it, but he doesn't really mean it as strongly as that, and really it ends up being a stuff. Okay. So in the truths of the Rebbe Yehuda, many of the truths are in the second chelik are written by the son, not by the Rebbe himself. So one of the truths in the second chelik, he writes, he thinks that the Eil Shabbos is right. Okay? He brings rights that the Eil Shabbos is right. It's a bunch of rights, and one of them is there's a din by the Gemara says that if you want to build your sukkah, you could use anything to make the defanas of the sukkah, even to the extreme that you could use an elephant to be the defanas of your sukkah. The Gemara like that's an extreme way. You could use even the defanas of an elephant, even an elephant. So he says no. He says elephants are not min kosher. Okay? Elephants are min tamei. So if there's a rule that only kosher minim, he says, so why how are you allowed to use an elephant? Okay, so he's bringing that as a right. So here's a number of rights. I'm mentioning this one just because the interesting part. Aside that elephants are interesting. Aside from that is that on the side of the Noid Behuda, there's a little star, and it says, afterwards it was Niskala to me why this right is not a good right. Okay, and other Svarim who talk about this say that the Rebbe Yehuda's son told them that Achakach Niskala to me was that my father came to me in a dream and told me that I made a mistake about this right. Okay, so the Rebbe Yehuda was like, I'm going to get something to say in this true sefer. This is my sefer. I have something to say over here. So he came to. I forgot the name of the sefer. That the Rebbe son, the one who wrote the sefer, told him that when I wrote in the scholar to me, it was in scholar that my father came to me in a dream. They didn't say that the Rebbe was trying to get his name into the sefer. Right? It wasn't no, they said that part, but that the son told him that in the scholar to me was that the father came to him, and he told him that the reason why the right is a mistake is as follows: when the Torah says you have to use kosher items when you make or things from minim ksherim when you make for a mitzvah, that's for things that are traditionally or expected to come from animal or plant sources. You have a shofar comes from an animal. Obviously, it comes from an animal. Over there, when the Torah says if you're picking a shofar, you have to pick shofar from a kosher animal. You're picking, you're making cloth. Cloth is made out of animal hides, so you make it out of a kosher meat. But when you're making something that's totally not supposed to be from animal product, you're making the wall of a sukkah. You make walls of sukkah out of wood and stones. So then that's totally like out of the parish. It's not even the kinds of things that the Torah talks about when it wants you to use them in kosher. It's not clear to me why that should be. What should be? The Torah has a requirement you only use kosher things. I don't know why it shouldn't apply to everything. But that's how he understands that that din that you have to use a kosher thing only applies to things that are supposed to come from animal. So use it from the kosher animal versus the trait. I'm not sure why it should be limited like that. I don't know what. I guess the dream didn't last long enough. Why should it be limited to that? What's the difference? How do we understand it? What does it mean that the Torah wants you only to use from min kosher? There's something good about meaning shem and something bad about meaning tomato. I don't know what's good or bad about that. Remember the Torah tells us. So what's the difference? What's the difference?
You're not having an animal. It's animals of a wall. It's not an animal. You're not using an animal. You're using a wall. Happens to be the wall is an animal. And
I happen to have the cloth, and it happens to be maybe some shape animal. What's the difference?
Tell me, according to the Torah, said to go get an animal and do that. The Torah requires certain animals.
But Torah says also get walls for your sukkah. So I have to get walls for my sukkah. So I can get from wood or stone or animals. What's the difference really? What's really the difference? Well, what's the? It just you have to do something. So he doesn't say that's because there are dinim in what the shofar has. If you could say this, a shofar has dinim to what it has to be made out of. So you can't use a karen. You have to use a shofar. So once there are dinim, then there are also other details. And this doesn't have a din to it. There's no din to the walls. I'll go for you. Use anything to walls. That's a different answer. That's not what his answer is. Really, the schach is and the fathers is just that you just have to have it like a hefsher mitzvah. Okay, but so if he would have said that it is that whenever there's a requirement on the thing, I could have heard that. Okay, let's go.
I mean, this is a possible, approach towards a different shiloh that was discussed by Achronim about whether you could use shul and chazir as the fuel for your Hanukkah candles. There was a big machlokas, and I don't even think this svara was mentioned by anybody spoke about it. It's for Ibud, maybe, there's a cool Megillah Sota, there's some that's a possibility Tosos raises somewhere that maybe it doesn't have to be a Levaim Shev, it's for Ibud. But here you can say just the same way, you can give the same parents, so that maybe it should be kosher for this reason, because you don't have to use something from animals, obviously, as the fuel for
right. So point from Hanukkah, I don't know, but I hadn't thought about that, but Hanukkah is different because it always comes from a plant or animal source. In other words, it comes from a food source. So it either comes from olives or cows, or that's what it comes from. So then it could be, even according to him, the rules would still be you have to use from a min kosher. As opposed to the finals of a sukkah come from something that's not food b'chlal. It's not in the whole parsha of food. It comes from a piece of wood. And at least when you make Hanukkah candles, I mean, we have paraffin, but until 100 years ago, people made their oil was out of.
But it's not a
animals and vegetables.
It's not a din if you have something.
You think if the din is just that it's a requirement to use it?
It'll be kosher anyway. There's no right.
Right. Okay. Fine. So now getting back to Techeles, and now we heard this background. Now we heard some background. According to Earl Shabbos, that the din of that you have to have a min kosher only so the thing has Teres Hashem b'ficha. There's of course no din that Techeles has to be made from a min kosher, because Techeles is used for tzitzis and for the in the Mishkan, and it's used for big day kahuna. All those things are not things that have Teres Hashem b'ficha. And so according to Shabbos, of course you could use a treif min to make your Techeles. The shaila is, what about according to the Ramah and the Magen Avraham that are saying that no, it's even by all mitzvahs, but all mitzvahs have such a rule, they have to be from a min kosher. Would we say this? So therefore, does that mean that if you pick up a fish and you say, this is what I think the Techeles is, that I should know it's not Techeles because it's a min tummy? It can't be. You have to have from a min tummy. Okay. Few answers have been given. Okay. The first one, I thought was the weakest. Okay, and the other two basically are better answers. Okay. The first answer was, I unfortunately I don't remember where I saw this. Better that way. And the first one was that the rule of Aruch is only applies when I have a choice of I can use anything that I want to. Let's say I'm making walls for my sukkah, a shofar. I can use any animal that I want to. So we say when the Torah says when you want to pick one, pick the one that's from a min kosher. But what happens if the Torah told me specifically which one wants me to use? Okay, this comes up more when people talk about whether the other one, for big the Telah Shani, if Telah Shani means, if the word Telah means from a worm, okay, if that's what the word Telas means, it's shani, a certain dye that comes from a certain worm, that if the Torah told me use a specific thing to use it, well then, that means not like the rule. The rule is in general, I'm supposed to use things that are from a min kosher, but if the Torah told me specifically use Techeles, and it meant a certain kind of a fish, well, if it meant this specific one, well, it's telling you, don't follow the general rule. Usually the rule is like this, except this time I told you not to do that. So maybe the whole rule, let's say for a shofar, it doesn't tell you which shofar. Use a shofar from any animal that's a shofar. There's not a carrot. Any shofar you want to. So we understand the Torah wants us to pick the ones that are for the min kosher. If the Torah had said use the shofar from this specific animal, then obviously it means is in this case don't care about that theoretical rule. Okay, that was suggested. So therefore, if you decided that this fish, cuttlefish, is Techeles, if you decide that that's what the Torah meant when it said you should take a psil Techeles means take it from a cuttlefish, then that's what the Torah meant this specific one, then it's telling you don't follow the regular rules because this is a treif animal. Okay.
And the Rizin Rebbe and Rav Tzai both argue with that.
What do you say?
The Rizin Rebbe and Rav Tzai both say that the requirement isn't a specific animal. It's any dye which can produce, which is permanent and blue, will be okay. Would be kosher.
Really? That you could use any dye, even if it comes from a plant?
As long as it's permanent and it's.
And so you could use kol ilan also?
No, kol ilan is, I guess, any sea animal.
Why does it be a sea animal?
I guess it's the philosophy. That's what if there are multiple sea animals that might have those qualifications, that's what I'm saying, that there's no specific psul in a sea animal that you need a specific doctor.
Okay, so you're saying it could be that there are really 5 sea animals that produce that, in which case you're saying this wouldn't be a good answer. Because then if we found one that's treif, we'd say, no, we can't use it. The Torah didn't tell us to use this one. Maybe it had another one, maybe the Torah had in mind another one, we don't know.
No, I'm saying
maybe it had in mind other.
No, you're saying as long as the Torah knows a specific thing.
Right, so maybe, we don't know. We only found one so far, but we said, but maybe there's another one out there, and that the Torah had in mind, that's another option that we could have used.
I was saying you have to use some sort of treif sea animal.
It didn't force us to use that. Okay, but I think the answer. I think that it is specific. Yeah. Right. Well, I have to tell you something. Besides the people who are very involved in trying to decide which is Techeles, think about it. Most people, if you ask your kids who went to school, they thought that Techeles was a very specific one. That's a simple understanding. I believe you that they think that it's a general rule, but that's not the simple understanding. So it's not such a
You should invite Rabbi Chaim Tversky to.
Okay, I'll start up with people. Okay, so, but the reason why I think that's wrong is because the reason why I think that this answer can't be the right answer is because the Gemara that we're talking about, the Gemara in Shabbos, talks about this dinim of what could use for different things, and the Gemara says we have a raya that the tachash was a kosher animal because the Torah said you should use tachash to make a covering on the Mishkan. And therefore, since you're only letting use kosher things to make the Mishkan, therefore it must be the Tacheles is kosher. Whether the raya stands or not is not important. The Gemara has back and forth about whether that raya is true. But that's the Gemara's approach to it. It says, since you have to use kosher things to make the Mishkan, it must be the Tacheles is kosher. What are you talking about? If the rule is, if the Torah points at the animal and says, use that one, then use it even if it's treif, then Tacheles could have been treif. Who cares? If the Torah says, use the Tacheles, it was pointed and said, use that one. So no, if that's such a rule. So obviously the Gemara is saying, no. That's when the Mersham operates, that he only sends us to use kosher things. He doesn't tell us to use treif things. So if you point at chilazim that use chilazim, then we could deduce it must be it's a kosher min. He would never have told us to use a treif min. It doesn't work like that. This is sort of like, it's like part of the rules. He doesn't tell us exceptions to the rules. When he tells us to use something, it must be that it's a kosher one. Okay? The Gemara's Tachash tells us that this doesn't sound like a good answer. Okay. The Rebbe Yehuda, in that same tshuva, in that same tshuva, says a different answer. He says that he's talking about Techeles. He's been rayas from Techeles, but he's really talking about using a certain shmir on your tefillin. Okay, and that thing was made something that was not kosher. He wants to know if that's kosher. And his discussion is a lot about Techeles and Techeles Shani, but he's trying to prove to a certain other case. And he says the din that you have to use a min kosher only applies to the base material. So if you want to make tefillin, and you have to use leather as the tefillin itself are made out of leather. You want to make a mezuzah that the cloth is made out of, that the cloth is what you write it on, that has to be min kosher. But if you dye it afterward, you color it, you add something to the base material, that there's no such rule that it has to be kosher. So the Gemara says tachash has to be kosher because the tachash is one of the covers on the Mishkan. So the tachash itself has to be kosher. But if you want to dye the big day kahuna with telah shani, that's okay. Because the material itself is wool. Wool is from a kosher animal. It's from a sheep. It's from a kosher animal. You want to put a dye into it that's from a treif animal, a treif fish. That's okay. The rules don't go that far. The doesn't go that far. He doesn't say why should it be like that. Somehow it's just an understanding that the ikar has to be kosher. The tuffles don't have to be kosher.
The Torah didn't say to make a b'tikkun on wool. It said use a specific colored wool.
So colored wool.
Right. It's not like saying make tefillin and then color black.
What's the difference in saying you have to have tefillin?
By definition, Tolashani or Techeles or Gemara are colored wools. By definition, they are.
What do you mean by that? What are you trying to say?
Like the definition of Techeles is blue wool.
And therefore,
you can't have. It's not. There was no requirement to make the b'tikkun on wool.
There is a requirement.
Yeah, but it has to be blue wool.
And you're saying is that if the Yehuda meant that if it's one of the main requirements and a secondary requirement, then Techeles is a main requirement. It's a primary requirement. But that's not what he's trying to say. He's trying to say not that it's a secondary requirement. It says it's the base material. When the Torah makes a requirement, it don't have a primary requirement to be black. But he's saying the blackness could come from treif. Even though it's one of the main requirements, it has to be black. But it's not the base. The base material is leather. The leather, which is colored, or the wool, which is dyed. I'm not sure it's different.
He doesn't say anywhere else in the Torah that it has to be wool. We just know it from the word Techeles.
Well, we know Techeles means
it is
wool that's dyed blue.
By definition, there's no separate way of knowing that it means to be wool. Just because the Techeles are going, whatever, that's how we know it's wool.
Yeah, I mean, it gets made from the Smichas Parshat like Techeles and Shabbos. That could be what they were.
Okay, I don't think that would bother him. He makes it. I can't tell. I understand really why he's saying it. Why is only the base material and not the dyes? But he says it depends on the base material. Okay. The Zina himself. The Rebbe Yehuda wants to say this to say back to his case that his shmir that he put on his tefillin would be kosher because he says the material is still going to be leather. The fact you put something else on top of it is not a problem. Okay. The Radziner himself. This, of course, was a big kasha on. He came up and he said you should use a certain fish. You should use that fish to make your Techeles out of it, and it was a treif fish. So the Radzina says, he says, I'm not surprised by that. He says because the Gemara says that blood from fish is kosher, and this is what we came to over here. We spoke about it last time that the din of tzir of dagim tmeim is kosher. That tells us both of those dinim, they're all coming from the same place, telling us that we had a special limud that the tzir of a behema and the tzir of an insect are tamei. But tzir of a fish is not tamei. The things that are excreted from fish extracted from fish. That's a better word. Extracted from fish are not kosher. So you're allowed to eat. It's halacha and pei gimel that you're allowed to eat their blood. And in our halacha we're learning that you're allowed to eat their tzir. So you're allowed to eat the extraction, that other liquid that comes out from his cuttlefish, from which he makes his techeles, is also kosher. He says, so what's the problem? From something that's kosher, it is kosher. I'm making something that is kosher. Okay, so there's an obvious question. He is himself. There's an obvious question on what he just said. Okay, which is, everybody assumes that the rule is that it doesn't make a difference whether it's kosher. I told you, if you use a cow that was in the vela, you're allowed to use that. even though the cow is not kosher, you can't eat it. And the opposite, if you have a horse, even if you use the hide of a horse, the hide of the horse is really kosher. You're allowed to eat the hide of a horse, but you're not allowed to use that for your tefillin because it comes from a min tamei. It doesn't depend on the rules of kashrus. It depends on the rules of is it a min kosher or a min tamei. So what do I care that the liquid that comes out of a cuttlefish is kosher to eat? It comes from a min tamei. A min tamei is still a min tamei. Okay, it's an obvious question because everybody assumes not like that. So he wants to be mechadish that we're all making a mistake. There's no such rule. There's no such rule that it only has to come from a min kosher and not from a min tamei. That's what everybody thinks like that. Everybody assumes that that's what it is. He says it's not true. The rule is really it has to be kosher and it can't be treif. Open up your regular chel galaf your day to find out whether it's kosher or treif. That's completely what it depends on. He says so. Why are you allowed to use? Why are you allowed to use? He said, but hides. Our rayas are going to be from oiros, from hides. He says that's not a raya. Because the din is really an or is really just as treif as the basar is. Or is really a part of the basar, it really be just as treif. It happens to be that the or is a part of the basar that became not royal achila, and the rules in Kashrus are when things are not royal achila, then they lose their status. They're kosher or treif, but they're inherently from a treif animal, but they're temporarily edible because they're not in an edible form. Right now, you can't eat them. So to eat from a cow, it's kosher, and from a horse's hide is temporarily edible because it's in an inedible form. It's temporarily kosher because it's in an inedible form. Okay, but be'etzem, it's treif.
Your emotions.
La'afuke, wait, I'm almost finished. La'afuke, sear of a dog, or the dam of a dog, is something that's obviously really edible. It's really edible because the dam of every other animal is considered edible. Dam of a dog is considered is edible. If the Torah went out of its way to tell us, or indirectly went out of its way to tell us that you're allowed to eat that means is that this is considered kosher. It's not considered, let me say it this way, it's not considered to be a yotzei of this fish. Our din are about yotzei, that a yotzei has the status of what it came from. In this case, it does not have that status. We saw last time by tzir that the chiddush is that even though it's not so directly part of the thing, it's still usher anyhow. So we are trying to tell us we shouldn't be worried about that. So the tzir, by telling us that tzir of a fish is kosher, it's telling us that it's completely kosher. What do you want to say though?
Remember when he talks about gelatin being parv?
I'm getting to gelatin. How do you know that?
Oh.
Very good. So at Rav in Mishnah Rav when he has his two long tubas about gelatin. In Yudayin, he says the shaila whether gelatin from the hides of an animal is kosher or treif is totally on this shaila. He doesn't say, but I don't think he talks about Techeles. I don't remember. I don't think so. He says it's totally on this shaila. Is our hides kosher because they're not royal achila, or are hides kosher because the Torah is matter them, and hides are totally mutter? And the nafkamina will be is, what happens if I take the hide and I make it edible? I take the hide and I turn it into gelatin, which is now a food item. So if the reason why the hides are kosher, are you allowed to eat them, is because they're not edible, but now they are edible. It was a temporary heter while they were not edible. But now they turn back into edible, so I'm not allowed to eat them. If they're mutter, because they're totally mutter, because hides are just not included, the Torah only answered the basar of the animal, not the hide, then just because it comes edible doesn't make a difference. That wasn't the kula, and he's machmer on that. He comes out, he has pages and pages, right? But he comes out that you should be machmer and say that it's because it's not royal achila, which is like Radzina saying. The reason why it's usher is good. The reason why it's mutter because it's temporarily not royal achila. If you turn around and make it royal achila, then it becomes usher. Okay, which is like the Radzina saying. Yes.
There's a Rosh when he was talking about gelatin about when it becomes parv. He was saying that
when it becomes parv,
you know why it's parv.
Right.
He said we're machmer like the or whatever it is. We said that to the extent to say that it's considered. He said the hides are not considered basar.
Okay.
He says bones could be considered basar because they're inside the flesh. But he says hides are not. He says they're not considered basar.
Basar is basar b'cholim.
Yeah,
or they're not kosher and treif.
No, basar b'cholim.
Basar b'cholim. Okay.
Basar for basar b'cholim.
Okay.
So.
But there, I don't remember what the Shulchan says. There it's different. There it's different because by basar, it depends on whether it's nice and tam or not. Whether something is considered basar as inflations, depends whether it's nice and tam. So then it's easier to say that it's not considered basar than to say that it's not basar as in treif. Treif doesn't depend on if it's nice and tam or not. Okay. The opposite, the whole opposite of this.
Chatzam Sofer says that. He says that the Chatzam Sofer has...
Oh, that's it. Just give me 1 second. I don't know if I'm clear what you're going to say. Just give me 1 second. It's right here on the bottom of the page. So the Dayan Weiss has an opposite shita, and he says he's talking about carmine, and he wants to say that maybe the reason why in the Mishkan they could use Telah Shani, that's what he's talking about over there, is because they had waited for it to dry out for 12 months. After it dried out for 12 months, that's when they finally use it. So by letting it be dried out, that's when it becomes mutter. And he says, no, it has to come from a min kosher. If it sat and dried out for 12 months, it still came from a min tummy anyhow, and you wouldn't be allowed to use it.
Let it dry out and then he took the comment out of the bug?
He's not talking about common. He's talking about Telah Shani. He's trying to figure out.
Die out of the animal or the worm if they're doing dried out for 12 months.
It's like in your house. You have.
If it's dried out, you're not going to get any dry out.
Like you have in your house, you have spices. Okay, that they're mutter because you hold that you don't worry about the bugs in them because you think they're dried out, and that they are very dried out. That means they can't still give time to it. I'm saying it still gives time. You still put parsley into your soup. You still think it gives time to it, even though it's dried out. It doesn't mean it can't give color just because it's dried out.
Because it gets time in its dry form. But you can take a bug that has maybe a dye out of it.
What's the difference getting a dye out of it and getting flavor out of it? You're right. We would assume that there could be nothing left to it, but
Yavish can't golf or whatever.
I was going to say something different. This is not what you mean. I was going to say something different, which is he's saying it in the case where it's mutter not because it's like a yotze or not edible. It's because it turns into offer. It turns into we say it's like it became back into its base elements. It turned back into nothing. In that case, you could hear that someone would say that in that case, it's not considered to come from the tummy anymore. It's not that it's a tummy that's mutter temporarily, or that's mutter at all. This stuff dried out to the point, it's mutter because it's nothing anymore, it's dirt. Okay, so in that case, the Machmer is the whole opposite extreme from what the Ratin is saying, is that as long as it's kosher, okay, it's the whole opposite. Okay, last thing is, this shiloh we talked about was for Techels. Most people here are not thinking about wearing Techeles for other reasons. That's what we're not talking about, though. Are they really right that those fish are really the ones that the Torah had in mind? That's what we're not talking about. But it's again to a different shiloh. The Chasam Sofer talks about whether you could use silk in a shul. In the parachas, you can make the parachas out of silk. Silk also comes from a treif animal, from a silkworm, from a talaz, from a worm. And he talks. I don't remember if he brings Rabbeinu Bachya, but many people bring. Rabbeinu Bachya says the reason why the Torah gives us all the meaning that you should make the Beis Hamikdash out of, it gives you all these fancy materials, Techels and Agaman and Zav and Kesef. He says, and how come the Torah didn't pick silk also? It's a very fine material. The Torah didn't pick it. He says because it's a min tamei. He says it's a min tamei, and the Torah doesn't want you to. That's the rule. You're not allowed to use min tamei. That's why the Torah didn't tell us to use silk in the first place. So the Chasam Sofer said it's not. I don't remember if it being Rabbeinu Bachya, I don't remember. But he's not convinced about that. He says, we talked about this when we talked about Kit Yishenishtana, that he says that by the time the silk turns itself into a parachas, by the time it's gone through all those steps and being dyed and being woven, it's already Nishtana, and it's not considered the original min tamei anymore. And Ketan, maybe could have been used in the Beis Hamikdash. Did you want to say something else?
I think people say, I read it, the Chasam Sofer said, he wants it the Chalazah might be a mint Torah, actually.
Well, everybody assumed it's a mint Torah, of course.
Right. I'm saying it's supposed to, everyone's assuming, no, until now we assume it's mint tamei.
No. We're saying, is it possible that it could be mint tamei?
No,
we're not assuming it's a mint tamei.
So he's saying that
the assumption is that it's a mint Torah.
It's a mint Torah.
Right, well, everybody else thought that it was a mint Torah also until they picked up a cuttlefish. It's a mint tamei. Everybody else would have, the Gemara says, like, we would all guess that. We're trying to be miyash of people who are saying things that are not so typical. But the normal thing, the simple thing would be that it should be a mint Torah. Okay.